afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Funders Together Advocacy 101 webinar. I'm Lauren Bennett. I'm the Communications and Public Affairs Manager here at Funders Together, and thank you for taking the time to join us today for this very important topic. Today's webinar is going to focus on how philanthropy can be involved in advocacy efforts and what limitations are in place for the different types of funders. We'll also be looking at real-life unique examples of how Funders Together members have participated in advocacy in their communities and nationally. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Just so you know, all participants are on mute and will remain on mute throughout the rest of the presentation. If you do have a question, you can go ahead and type it in the question box on the webinar panel, which is should be on the right-hand side of your screen. The question box does look like this. You can enter a question at any time, but we will be saving all content-related questions for the end of the presentation. And finally, since I know this question will be asked, yes, the presentation will be recorded, and the slides and the recording will be available after the presentation is over. So we'll go ahead and we'll send that out via email once we have that done. And you will have to log in to view the recording. So if you have any problems doing that, you can go ahead and email me at lauren@funderstogether.org. So now I would like to go ahead and introduce our speaker to you, Nikhil Pillai. He is counsel for the broader advocacy initiative at Alliance for Justice. He consults with and trains nonprofit organizations on the rules and strategies for legal and effective advocacy. Before joining Alliance for Justice, Nikhil was associate counsel at Working America, the community affiliate of the AFL-CIO. And in that role, he was responsible for drafting and negotiating operational agreements, advising staff on prospective legal concerns, and ensuring compliance with campaign finance and lobbying laws. Prior to that, he was a law fellow at AARP. So we're really excited to have him and his expertise here. So Nikhil, I'll go ahead and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hello. So my name is Nikhil Pillai, and as Lauren mentioned, I am counsel at Boulder Advocacy at Alliance for Justice. A little bit of background on Boulder Advocacy. Our goal is to make other nonprofits more bold in their advocacy. And we do this in three primary ways. The first is we have a lot of free resources online. These include fact sheets and sort of more in-depth publications that involve, best practices for foundations to do when writing grants, ways that 501c3, C4, and other organizations can work together, and other materials like that. We also have a free technical assistance line, so if you want free coaching about the laws that do impact your advocacy, you can either email us at advocacy@afj.org, you can call us at 866-675-6229, or you can email me directly at nikhil@afj.org. And lastly, we do offer trainings and webinars such as this. So with that being said, I was going to go through our agenda for today. So we're first going to talk about what advocacy is, because a lot of people conflate lobbying and advocacy. Advocacy is the umbrella term that is used to describe actions that are used to sort of bring about change, and lobbying is a way that is done. After we talk about what is advocacy, we'll talk about the differences between 501c3 private foundations, 501c3 public charities, and other types of nonprofits. We're then going to talk about the IRS lobbying limits for public charities, like your grantees, as well as the definitions of lobbying and how they apply to you. This is important because if something does not meet the definition of lobbying, it won't be considered lobbying. Then we're going to talk about sort of the three most common tools for funding advocacy. And then I do have some hypothetical questions we can go through at the end, but depending on the timing of the webinar, we may just open it up for questions instead at that point. So a lot of private foundations ask, should we support advocacy? To which we like to respond, can you afford not to? And again, that's sort of the primary function of private foundations, is that you sort of bring together all this money and then fund and promote advocacy, and there's a lot of ways that you have the ability to do so. And this ranges from funding advocacy to engaging in advocacy yourselves. So there's activities you can engage in as a capacity builder, which is where you build the capacity of your grantee to advocate and lobby. And this can sort of slide to from a responder where you don't necessarily proactively initiate policy change, but you are prepared to respond, to something like a general supporter where you get closer to engaging in advocacy on your own, but you're really funding your grantees to advocate through general support grants. And this goes all the way to being an advocate of change yourself, where you advocate loudly or quietly for your policy agenda. And we're going to go through some examples of funder involvement in advocacy. One example is the 11th Hour Project. They help to build the Animal Agriculture Reform Collaborative, which regularly meets to discuss various policy tactics to fight the industrial animal agriculture system. In this role, they act as a convener. They bring nonprofits and policy leaders to the table to find solutions. There's also other types of advocacy like litigation, where you're a responder, where again, you're not proactively initiating policy change, but you're responding to something that's happened. And an example is both the Bloomberg Philanthropies and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation co-launched an international fund to assist international governments in developing countries in defending laws that reduce tobacco use. Another example is the Meyer Memorial Trust, where they were acting as an advocate, where they were advocating for their policy agenda by educating the public. They used their blog to highlight the importance of being involved in advocacy and the shared expertise with various state committees and elected officials. This was a great way to both educate people as well as bring people together as a convener. Another way that a funder can be involved in advocacy is lobbying. And as we'll discuss in a little bit, there are some limitations to lobbying for foundations, and it depends on whether or not you're a private foundation or a public or community foundation. But an example of being involved in lobbying is the United Way of Mile High, which is in Colorado. The Mile High United Way focused advocacy efforts at the state level by hiring a lobbyist and funding organizations that do work in policy and advocacy. And this includes work that was grassroots, research, as well as lobbying. So now we're going to talk about the differences between private foundations, public foundations and charities, and other types of nonprofits. And on the slides, or even in sort of discussions with other organizations, you may hear terms like 501c3, 501c4, C5, and so on and so forth. 501c3, C4, that's just where in the tax code these designations come from. And a 501c3 organization is either going to be a private foundation or a public charity or public foundation. A 501c4 organization is going to be a social welfare organization. A 501c5 organization is generally a labor organization, like a union. And a 501c6 organization is a trade association, like a chamber of commerce. Now, this is important to keep in mind because your designation will determine the type of work you're allowed to be engaged in. So for private foundations, like the Meyer Memorial Trust or the Ford Foundation, they are tax-exempt organizations, and contributions to them are tax deductible. However, they can't really engage in lobbying activities, and they are taxed on both the foundation level as well as the managers that approve the lobbying activity. And so functionally, they can't engage in lobbying activities. Similarly, they cannot engage in electoral activities. This means they cannot support or oppose a candidate for public office. This is not to say that they cannot speak out against elected officials so long as it's tied to an action that they have done in their official capacity that's already happened. However, they should not tie it to an election or a future campaign or anything like that. A 501c3 public foundation or public charity is something like the United Way of Mile High United Way, or the Alliance for Justice, my organization. These are also tax-exempt organizations, and contributions to them are tax deductible, and they can engage in a limited amount of lobbying. There's two ways this is measured. It's either measured through the insubstantial part test or the 501h expenditure test. However, like private foundations, they too cannot engage in electoral activities. Now, this is especially important for foundations to know what the sort of parameters surrounding a 501c3 public charity is, because they tend to be your grantees. Other organizations, 501c4s, C5s, and C6s, are also tax exempt. However, contributions to them are not tax deductible. However, they can engage in an unlimited amount of lobbying, and they can also engage in electoral activities, though this has to be their secondary activity. And these activities must follow election law for these organizations. So, public charities and public foundations may lobby. However, they must stay within the limits set by the IRS. This is determined by either the insubstantial part test or the 501h expenditure test. Alternatively, private foundations are taxed heavily on their lobbying activity, and they pay a tax on their lobbying expenditures. The initial tax on these activities is 20% on the foundation and 5% on the managers. And if they continue to engage in this type of activity, the tax goes up to 100% on the foundation and 50% on the managers. Again, this is why we say that lobbying is functionally prohibited for private foundations. So, how much lobbying for public charities and public foundations? Again, there's two tests that the IRS provides. The first is the insubstantial part test. Under this test, organizations may not engage in more than an insubstantial amount of lobbying. Now, the IRS does not provide a whole lot of guidance on what that means and how much activity is considered insubstantial, but this is the default test organizations operate under, and it's an activities-based test. So any activities associated with your lobbying activity, including volunteer activity, would be considered part of lobbying. Alternatively, there's the 501h expenditure test. And we think this is a great option for a lot of public charities and public foundations because there are clear dollar-based limits. There's a single one-time election your organization would have to do where your organization would fill out the form IRS 5768. And it's a very short form. It really just asks for your organization's name, address, and employer identification number. Under this test, you only have to track the expenditures associated with your lobbying, and it provides a very clear definition of what is and is not lobbying. Also important for private foundations to keep in mind is the definitions for lobbying under the 501h expenditure test are the same definitions that apply to your lobbying activity. So if your organization wants to align your definition of lobbying with your grantees, a great way to do that would be to suggest that your grantees take the 501h expenditure test. Under the 501h expenditure test, it's pretty straightforward to calculate your organization's lobbying limit. The first thing you do is calculate your organization's annual expenditures. Once you've done that, you use this chart that the IRS provides. So if your organization's annual expenditures are $500,000 or less, your overall lobbying limit is going to be 20% of that. And as your annual expenditures increase, your lobbying limit also increases until you find an organization that has annual expenditures of $17 million or more, at which point their lobbying limit is capped at $1 million. And your grassroots lobbying limit, which we will define shortly, is 25% of your overall limit. Now, I know a lot of you don't like math, and personally, I'm not a huge fan of math myself, and so Boulder Advocacy does have a 501h lobbying limit calculator available on our website for free. But for a 501c3 organization that has made the 501h election, if their annual expenditures are $500,000, their overall lobbying limit is going to be 20% of that, so $100,000, and their grassroots lobbying limit is 25% of their overall limit, so $25,000. For an organization with a larger proposed annual expenditures of, say, $11 million, we would go back to the chart, and it's the second to last row. And using that, we find that their overall lobbying limit is $700,000 and their grassroots lobbying limit is $175,000. So you can see that these lobbying limits are pretty generous. But moving on, private foundation avenues of advocacy. So now that we've discussed lobbying a little bit, we'll talk about other types of advocacy organizations can engage in. These include anything from educating legislators and educating the public, to regulatory efforts, to litigation and skills training, things like that. Private foundations can engage in activities to encourage voting, though there are some limits that are associated with that, and we will discuss that shortly. But again, they cannot engage in lobbying or partisan political activity, which is why those two boxes are in red. But here are some examples of other types of advocacy that private foundations have and can engage in. The Rakes Foundation, for example, educated the public by talking about the power of belonging. Other organizations like Funders Together and MRBF discussed the value of writing an op-ed and have published op-eds themselves. The Simmons Foundation has done a skills training. And the skills training is a great way for foundations to get people involved because you can talk about the issues that matter to your organization as part of the skills, but there doesn't necessarily need to be any lobbying associated with that. And again, not all advocacy is lobbying. So if an activity does not have all the elements of lobbying, it's not going to be considered lobbying. And this is important for both private foundations and other organizations to keep in mind because you can frame your activities so they may look like lobbying, but if they don't actually meet the definition of lobbying, they won't be considered lobbying for IRS tax purposes. So the 501H lobbying definitions. It's applicable to both private foundations and again is a great option for grantees so you can align your definitions of what is and is not lobbying. So the IRS under the 501H definition splits lobbying into two different groups. The first is direct lobbying and the second is grassroots lobbying. Direct lobbying is a communication with the legislator that expresses a view about specific legislation. Grassroots lobbying is a communication with the general public that expresses a view about specific legislation and includes a call to action. And again, if either type of lobbying does not meet every part of this definition, it won't be considered lobbying. So, what is a communication? What is a legislator? What is specific legislation? We'll discuss all of that moving forward. A communication is any form of communication, which includes anything from a letter to a phone call to a meeting to a tweet if it's directed at a legislator. And a legislator is defined as U.S. legislators and their staff, state legislators and their staff, a county board of supervisors, city council, and their staff. It also includes a president, governor, mayor, or any other executive official if they participate in the formulation of legislation. A common way this happens is if they're signing off on a piece of legislation. What's not going to be considered a legislator are zoning boards, school boards, housing authorities, and other special purpose bodies. Something else to keep in mind is there's something called the special legislator rule. So for ballot measures, which include things like ballot initiatives, referenda, constitutional amendments, and bond measures, members of the general public are going to be considered legislators because they're the ones that will be voting on the piece of legislation. So, what is specific legislation? Specific legislation includes an existing bill, the Senate confirmation or opposition to anything from the executive branch, so judicial nominations, things like that, the budget, and the idea for a piece of legislation if that idea is specific enough that the legislator who's hearing it can go from that meeting and write a bill. And a sort of very clear example of that is if you are in New Jersey and you bring a bill to your legislator and say, this is a bill from New York that was passed and we really like it. You should pass this bill too. In that case, even though there's no existing piece of legislation, the fact that the legislator can leave that conversation and write up a piece of legislation themselves is enough for that conversation to be considered to have been about specific legislation. Now, sometimes this can get a little tricky for some folks. And if it does, we are happy to help. Again, you can call us on our free technical assistance line or just email me directly at nikhil@afj.org. If you have any questions about whether or not the activity you are engaging in may or may not be considered specific legislation. What's not going to be considered specific legislation is regulations, executive orders, the enforcement of existing laws, or litigation. Now, normally when I do an in-person training, a lot of people ask us, wait, so you're saying that an executive order is not considered specific legislation? That is correct. If you were to agree or disagree with an executive order that the president had put out, you are allowed to speak out on that without restriction. However, you do want to keep in mind that your organization may not be engaged in partisan political activity. So what does that look like in practice? You could say, President Trump, your executive order on immigration is bad for the country. This is not the foundations the country was built on. What you could not say is, President Trump, your executive order on immigration is terrible, and we will remember this in 2020. So long as you're just talking about an executive action or order and only referring to it in that sort of context, it's still not going to be considered either partisan activity or lobbying. So that was direct lobbying, a communication with the legislator that expresses a view about specific legislation. Grassroots lobbying is a communication with the general public that expresses a view about specific legislation and includes something called a call to action. A call to action is telling someone to contact a legislator, so call your senator, call your representative, anything like that. Providing the address, telephone number, or other contact information of a legislator. So saying something like, this bill is no good, here's our senator's number, anything like that. Providing a mechanism to enable communication with legislators. So that's something like a sign-on letter. Or identifying the legislators that will be voting on a piece of legislation. And any one of these is a call to action and enough to make something grassroots lobbying. So if you are a public foundation or public charity that wants to engage in this type of work, if you're including one call to action, you may as well include all the calls to action. And here's an example of grassroots lobbying. Senators are drafting legislation similar to the House's American Health Care Act and hoping to hold a vote on this health care reform bill as early as the 4th of July. It goes on to describe the House bill and the issues with it, and then says, we need you to raise your voice to Congress, which is why we are organizing a national call-in day to save Medicaid on Thursday, June 22nd. This would be considered grassroots lobbying because this is on this organization's website. So it's a communication with the general public. It expresses a view about specific legislation, the American Health Care Act, as well as the Senate equivalent. And there's a call to action. It's a mechanism for people to have the National Call-In Day. In addition to that, at the bottom of the page, it says make a call, let Congress know how important federal funding is to ending homelessness in your community. Make sure to add, click, I've finished with my call when you are done. That is another mechanism to make the call. Here's another example of a tweet that would be considered grassroots lobbying. It says, yes on HB 2004 because no-cause evictions are causing family homelessness. Tell your senator to bring this change. It's a tweet, so it's a communication with the general public. It expresses a view on specific legislation, yes on HB 2004. And it includes a call to action. Tell your senator. But if something does not have a call to action, it won't be considered lobbying. So if you say something like learn more, take action, support our efforts, or get involved, that's okay, and that communication won't be considered grassroots lobbying. So for example, that same tweet from earlier, you can still say yes on HB 2004 because no-cause evictions are causing family homelessness. But instead of tell your senators, if you said something like we need to bring this change, this no longer is grassroots lobbying. And if you do have any questions about whether activities your organization, private foundation, public foundation is engaging in, whether or not those activities would be considered grassroots lobbying or not, again, you can reach out to us and we're happy to help. That's what we're here for. In addition to direct and grassroots lobbying, there are also 4 lobbying exceptions. These are the nonpartisan analysis, study, or research, a request for technical assistance, self-defense, and examinations and discussions of broad social, economic, and similar problems. These are things that may look like lobbying, but fall within an exception, so they won't be considered lobbying. Nonpartisan analysis. If your organization creates an analysis and it represents a full and fair discussion of an issue and is broadly disseminated, that analysis can express a view on specific legislation, and it can contain an indirect call to action, which is to say you can list the senators or legislators who will be voting on a piece of legislation. Now you may be asking, what does fair and full discussion mean? The IRS, again, does not provide a whole lot of guidance on this, but what it does say is that full and fair discussion means that someone reading your analysis can look at it and see what the other side's conclusion is. So whoever is opposing the issue that you are providing an analysis on. And it's not to say that 50% of your analysis needs to be about your issue and 50% needs to be at the other issue, but you should mention it, you should sort of raise it as, that there is in fact opposition to your issue. And what broadly disseminated means is it needs to be widely disseminated to all types of people. So that means you distribute it to the press, you have it in your office, you post it on your website, it is broadly disseminated. Additionally, if you are planning on sending your nonpartisan analysis to certain legislators, you want to make sure that you're sending it to all legislators of that class. So if you're sending it to legislators on a certain committee, you should send it to all legislators on that committee. It needs to be broadly disseminated, which is also to say it should be disseminated in a nonpartisan manner. The next lobbying exception is technical assistance. If you are invited in writing on behalf of a committee and the testimony you are providing is available to all members of that committee, you may express a view on specific legislation. So if there is a legislator that your organization has a relationship with, and that legislator says, hey, we're working on this issue on the health care bill, and we'd really like you to come and speak, you could respond, we would love to, but would it be possible to get an invitation on behalf of the whole committee and the invitation in writing, so a letter or an email, just in writing? Because that way, your testimony would not be considered lobbying if you are expressing a view on specific legislation. The third third lobbying exception is self-defense. If there's legislation or an issue that relates to your organization's powers and duties, your tax-exempt status, or the deductibility of your contributions, your speaking out on that issue may be considered self-defense. Now, this exception is incredibly narrow, and so we do suggest that you consult with an attorney if you do think it's applicable. And the last lobbying exception is the examination and discussion of broad social, economic, and similar problems. In this case, there's no specific legislation and no call to action, and this tends to look like things like a blue ribbon panel, an annual report, or the early stages of policy development. So the key points for your grantees is that all 501c3 public charities have a right to lobby. So that is to say, they can influence legislation. And many activities that influence public policy will not even meet the definition of lobbying. And again, these definitions that we just described also apply to private foundations. So for example, if a private foundation had a communication with the general public that expresses a view about specific legislation, but there's no call to action, that would not be considered grassroots lobbying for that private foundation. And again, foundations can support advocacy, and as we spoke about earlier, there are many ways to do this. But the three we're going to focus on for the moment are as a capacity builder, which again is to build the capacity of your grantees to advocate and lobby, to be a convener, which is when you bring nonprofits and policy leaders to the table to find solutions, and funding advocacy and lobbying efforts. So a capacity builder. A great example of this, again, is the Meyer Memorial Trust. They have funded advocacy through 1- and 2-year grants towards grassroots campaigns, and through these grants, the trust has seen positive results, specifically around the 2016 passing of a $258.4 million bond measure on affordable housing that was the largest measure of its kind ever on the City of Portland's ballot. So if your organization has goals it wants to achieve, you can build the capacity of your nonprofit to go out and achieve these goals. And it doesn't have to be that you are funding lobbying activity. You can fund skills trainings, you can fund other activities and other forms of advocacy that your grantees can engage in. And an example of a convener is the Heading Home Minnesota Funders Collaborative. In late 2016, the collaborative decided to create a focused initiative with the state of Minnesota's Office to Prevent and End Homelessness, working with the lead staff there who facilitate the State Interagency Council on Homelessness, and stressed that the collaborative was ready to commit more funds and work in partnership with the state on this important issue, which is a statewide concern. Again, this is important because you're bringing together nonprofits and policy leaders, as well as the state, to work on these issues that matter to your organization. And the third thing we're going to focus on is public and private foundations supporting advocacy. This is to say that your organizations can fund advocacy and lobbying efforts, and we're going to go over a couple ways that you can completely legally do it. But before we get into that, we're going to talk about earmarking and the definition of earmarking, because you will hear it a little. The definition of an earmark is a grant by a private foundation if the grant is given pursuant to an agreement, either oral or written, that the grant will be used for a specific purpose. Or put a different way, If you make an agreement that the money that you are providing will be used for a specific purpose, that money is then earmarked for that purpose. But private foundation funding for advocacy and lobbying. Again, you can support public charities that engage in non-lobbying advocacy almost without restriction. And when I say almost, it's only because there are some limits on the support you can provide for voter registration. The next slide will provide some detail on that. And you can support public charities that engage in lobbying without earmarking the grants for lobbying. However, you cannot support public charities with grants that are earmarked for lobbying. This is for private foundations. But briefly about voter registration drives, private foundation grants that are earmarked for voter registration drives must meet specific requirements. Again, if you're just providing a grant and that grant money is used for voter registration activities, that's not going to be considered earmarked. For something to be earmarked, the grant must be specifically provided for the purpose of a voter registration drive. But if there is a grant and it is earmarked for voter registration activity, the project funded must be sponsored by a 501c3 organization. It must be conducted in a non-partisan manner. It must be conducted in 5 or more states, and it can't be confined to one specific election cycle. There are also additional rules about the voter registration drive being run by an organization that meets additional rules related to diversity of its funding. If you do have questions about whether or not this applies to you, again, feel free to reach out to us and we can chat through it with you. But in terms of ways that private foundations can fund lobbying, here are 2 completely legal avenues for private foundations to fund grantees that lobby. The first is a general support grant, and the second is a specific project grant. If a private foundation does not earmark a grant for lobbying, the foundation is not legally responsible for the grantee's lobbying. Which is to say, if you say this grant is not earmarked for lobbying, that grant, in fact, can be used for lobbying. And if you have questions on how to find grant language that includes that, we do have a sample general support grant available on our website and in some of our resources. The second avenue that private foundations can fund grantees that lobby is called a specific project grant. Now, how the specific project grant rule works. If the foundation receives a specific project grant with a budget, and the private foundation's grant is equal to or less than the specific project's non-lobbying component, in that case, there will be no taxable expenditure for the private foundation. So, if there is a project budget for $100,000 and $80,000 of that budget is for public education and $20,000 is for lobbying, the private foundation can fund up to $80,000 of that project without incurring a taxable expenditure. Again, that same project, $80,000 going to public education and $20,000 going towards lobbying, 2 foundations can both come in and both fund the project at $50,000 each, and neither of them will incur a taxable expenditure. This is because neither of them are giving more than $80,000 to this project. Because both the grants are equal to or less than the non-lobbying component of the project budget, neither foundation will incur a taxable expenditure. And again, if you want sample specific project grant agreement language, we have resources available on our website and in paper if you'd prefer that. And it includes language on how best to use these types of avenues for funding lobbying. Restrictive clauses in grant agreements. Restricting grantees from lobbying is not necessary. Restrictive grant clauses limit a grantee's flexibility to accomplish their mission and their ability to lobby within their own limits. Furthermore, it sort of hinders your ability to maximize your own money. And lobbying restriction is only really necessary when a private foundation makes a grant to a non-501c3 organization. Conversely, helpful clauses in grant agreements include things like, this grant is not earmarked for lobbying. If a grant, in fact, is not earmarked for lobbying, you might as well say, this grant is not earmarked for lobbying. If a grant is for a specific project, you can say this is a specific project grant. And if your grant is for general support, your grant should state that. Now, a good clause is this grant is not earmarked for lobbying. Again, so long as the grant is in fact not earmarked for lobbying, this is helpful language to include. What's a bad clause is this grant may not be used for lobbying. Again, unless in fact that grant is to a non-501c3 organization. Now, your organization can make grants to non-public charities. Private foundations may make grants to 501c4 organizations or other non-public charities as long as the grant is for charitable purposes. Charitable purposes include any permitted 501c3 public charity activity except for lobbying and voter registration. However, if a private foundation is making a grant to a 501c4 organization, it must exercise something that is known as expenditure responsibility. Expenditure responsibility includes a pre-grant inquiry, writing, so that would be things that include the prohibited activities, requirements on subgranting, and other things like that. And again, this is the time you would want to include this grant may not be used for lobbying. And expenditure responsibility also includes reporting requirements. If you do have questions about this, we do have resources online, or you can contact us directly for any assistance. For public foundations that make grants to 501c4 organizations or other non-public charities, again, they can do that, but the grant, again, must be for charitable purposes. However, something that public foundations or public charities want to keep in mind is that the whole grant that they make to a non-public charity will be treated as a lobbying expenditure for them, absent any evidence to the contrary. Furthermore, it would be counted towards their grassroots lobbying limit, which, as you recall, is smaller than their overall lobbying limit, unless it's earmarked otherwise. Now, there are ways to do this, including using controlled grants. And again, if you do have any questions about this, you can contact Alliance for Justice for assistance. But the funding advocacy key point. Foundations have a great deal of power, and they have a huge capacity for funding advocacy. Again, this can be anything from being a capacity builder to a general supporter to a convener to funding special projects or being an advocate themselves. And all foundations can legally maximize funding for organizations that lobby by making general support grants or specific project grants. Furthermore, you can let grant applicants know that you are willing to fund advocacy and lobbying. And you should also avoid restrictions in grant agreements unless they are necessary. So for example, if you are making a grant to a non-public charity. And again, if you do have any questions, you can contact us for assistance. Now, we have a couple minutes. I would say we could spend maybe 5 minutes going through the hypothetical situation. So on the right side of your GoToWebinar, there's a question box you can use. So if you want to answer the questions in the question box, we can then look through the answers and then answer the questions for you. So our first question is, a 501c3 organization working on gun control issues requests a $20,000 general support grant. The grant proposal describes the group's past success in lobbying the legislature for a ban on semi-automatic weapons. Is this okay? And again, if you want to use the question box on the right side of your page to answer it, that would be great.
The answers are coming in, and they're overwhelmingly yes.
Great. There's no excise tax to the foundation because of the general support grant language. The next question is, a 501c3 grantee plans a study on housing discrimination and plans to give part of your grant to its affiliated 501c4 to fund dissemination of the report at the 501c4's annual conference. Is this okay?
And again, we're getting a lot of yes answers.
Excellent. Yes, because it's still a charitable activity. This is something 501c3 organizations can do, so it's still considered charitable activity. A 501c3 requests $100,000 to fund its campaign in opposition to a voter initiative that would ban affirmative action in the 501c3's home state. Is this okay?
So far, we have an answer of no. We have an answer of yes. Looks like we have a mixed bag on this one.
Great. So in this case, this would consider a grant earmarked for direct lobbying because it's a ballot measure campaign. So if you recall from way earlier in this training, in ballot measures, members of the general public are going to be considered legislators. So in this instance, the foundation would be taxed if it gives this grant. Now, alternatively, if a 501c3 organization provided a project budget that said, we're going to spend $300,000 on this project, of which $100,000 is going to be used to partially to fund this campaign in opposition to a voter initiative that would ban affirmative action, in that case, a private foundation can fund up to the non-lobbying portion of that specific project grant. So question 4. A 501c3 organization submits a grant request for $8,000 to fund part of its $15,000 project focused on homelessness. The budget for the project includes $2,000 to draft and advocate for a new anti-camping ordinance in the city. Is this okay?
And overwhelmingly, the responses have been yes.
Great. Exactly. The grant is less than the $13,000 non-lobbying amount, and therefore there would be no excise tax on the private foundation. And our last question is, one of your 501c3 grantees has applied for renewal of a general support grant. In conversations with the 501c3's executive director, you learn that the organization exceeded its lobbying limits in the previous year and had to pay an excise tax. Is the foundation liable for the grantee exceeding its limits, and can you give a renewal grant?
We have that they are not liable and they can give a renewable grant. Some other answers are they depend on the other funders and not liable, but not sure about the renewal. So we have a little bit of confusion on this question.
Great. So again, the foundation is not liable for the charity's violation. It's a general support grant. Again, it can also renew the general support grant despite the past violation. Now, the reason we include this example is because in the event that it was a specific project grant, if the private foundation has reason to know that the specific project grant's budget that it was given was not, in fact, accurate, at that point, the private foundation may be taxed. However, for general support grants, that's not the case. And those are the last of my questions, or well, my hypotheticals. But if you do want more information, again, we do have resources online, or you can reach out to us directly. My favorite sort of private foundation resource that we have is called the Philanthropy Advocacy Playbook. And it's a quick read. It's not too in-depth or too overwhelming. And it's a great resource for private foundations. We also have some Spanish language resources if that is something your organization is interested in. And I was going to take questions from you guys if you have them at the moment.
Great, thank you. So we'll go ahead and, as Nikhil said, we'll open it up to questions. So if you do have any, you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A box, as you were doing with the answers from before. So while we wait for that to come in, I do want to make you aware of some of the Funders Together advocacy resources that we have that would be beneficial in addition to the resources from Alliance for Justice. We do have our policy priority pages that outline our different policy priorities for the administration, as well as some messaging guides. We also have a webinar that we've done in previous years around advocacy, and also our legal limitations on lobbying that kind of expand on what Nikhil talked about today. These, along with all of the Alliance for Justice webinar or resources that Nikhil outlined, we will make those available, and we'll give you the links through an email after the presentation is over, so probably tomorrow, very beginning of next week. So as I mentioned, you can go ahead and put questions into the Q&A box. So one question that we have is, so if we're interested, we're interested in being more involved in advocacy as a public foundation, where do you suggest that we start?
So public foundations are sort of less restrictive in terms of their advocacy than private foundations. Again, this is because they're treated like public charities, which is to say they can engage in lobbying, just not on a so long as they're within their lobbying limits. However, in terms of starting lobbying, this sort of goes into another training we do where we talk about capacity building. But if you're talking about in terms of the activities you want to engage in, you can sort of measure or use benchmarks to see where you're most effective. So for some organizations, the fact they happen to have so much money, should we all be so lucky, but the fact they have as much money means they're really great at being a capacity builder or convener. They can bring people in together. Other organizations have a great sort of knowledge and expertise base. So they can be an advocate, not necessarily in terms of lobbying, but in terms of educating the public. Again, it really depends on your organization and the strengths you have. From a practical perspective, it's great to start off with the budget, and especially if you do have the 501H election, you can sort of measure out how much lobbying you can engage in, and based on that, prioritize sort of prospective legislation that comes out. But again, if you want sort of more detailed answer, we're happy to chat about it. So something I should mention is that the definitions of lobbying that I've provided today and the lobbying we are discussing is the IRS definition of lobbying, and it's what relates to your tax-exempt status. States may have laws on state lobbying, which may be broader than the IRS definition, but those do not impact your tax-exempt status.
Great, thank you. We have a couple more questions that have come in. Do you have any resources that rate the effectiveness of various advocacy actions in comparison to each other? For example, emails versus a letter, et cetera?
Right. We do have something called the Advocacy Capacity Tool, which is a free tool. It's used more for measuring your advocacy initially than it is for measuring the effectiveness, but as people do use it more and respond to it and update their sort of profiles on the site, you can see how in different fields, different types of advocacy have been effective or ineffective. In terms of like a hard rule, really face-to-face, door-to-door canvassing tends to be the most effective way, but again, depending on who you ask, there's a text message service firm, for example, that will say that text messaging is the most effective way to reach people. Phone firms will say phone calls, but the Advocacy Capacity Tool would be my suggestion. It's free. It takes about 40 minutes to fill out. There's a quick version called Act Quick that will take about 15 minutes to fill out. You can also look at other sort of nonprofit organizations like the Board of Nonprofits who may have resources that actually speak to this with more detail.
Great, thank you. So one other question, a 501c3 gets most of its funding from private foundations in the form of operating grants. Each of the operating grants is less than the lobbying portion of the expenses. So the question is, are these foundations not violating any laws?
Right. Well, to begin with, if it's a general operating grant or a general support grant, that entire money can be used for lobbying, and the foundation would not be responsible for it. But even if it's earmarked for a specific project, so long as the grants are less than the lobbying amount, or the non-lobbying amount rather, equal to or less than the non-lobbying amount, there's no taxable expenditure for those foundations. So even if there's 100 foundations and it's clear that lobbying is being funded, so long as none of those foundations are actually funding more than the non-lobbying portion, there will be no taxable expenditure for them.
Great, thanks. So we have time for one more question before we go ahead and close out this webinar. So earlier in the presentation, you had talked a little bit about litigation and gave an example of that. Could you expand a little bit on different litigation opportunities and what limitations might be in place for that?
Right. So, I mean, the limitations are a little easier. It's just that litigation tends to take much, much longer than other types of advocacy campaigns, just due to the fact that the judicial system takes a minute to sort of get going, and the fact that decisions can be challenged. In terms of opportunities for civil rights movements, I mean, the ACLU is clearly sort of the largest entity in that space, but there are a lot of smaller organizations that also do this type of work. And that activity is not considered lobbying. So funding even non-501c3 organizations is a little easier in that instance, because so long as the litigation is tied to your organization's exempt purpose, that's one way to do it.
Great, thank you. So I think that's all the time we have for today. Again, I do also want to kind of add, for the question about where do I start, another great resource is your peers. So Funders Together, as we are happy to connect you with other funders who might be the same foundation type that you are, and if you have any questions and you want to get together and talk with them, we're happy to go ahead and connect you with those other funders. Nikhil, thank you so much. This was a great presentation with a lot of awesome information, so I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. As we mentioned, we have recorded this webinar, so we will make the recording and the slides available to you, as well as the resources that Nikhil mentioned and the links to the Funders Together resources. If you have any questions in the meantime, please reach out to us, or Nikhil has provided his contact information, so he'll be happy to answer your questions as well. So thank you for your time, and please enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks so much, everyone.